Much as we felt the shock, there was little time for self-indulgence. Never were moments of greater importance. For while father and uncle were hewing a new axle, two men came from the head of the company to tell about the snow. It was a terrible piece of news. Those men reported that on the 28th of that month, the larger part of the train had reached a deserted cabin near Truckee Lake, the sheet of water now known as Donner Lake, at the foot of Fremont's Pass in the main chain of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The following morning they had proceeded to within 3 miles of the summit, but finding snow there 5 feet in depth, the trail obliterated, and no place for making camp, they were obliged to return to the spot they had left early in the day. There, they said, the company had assembled to discuss the next move, and great confusion prevailed as the excited members gave voice to their bitterest fears. Some proposed to abandon the wagons and make the oxen carry out the children and provisions. Some wanted to take the children and rations and start out on foot, and some sat brooding in dazed silence through the long night. The messengers further stated that on the 30th, with Stanton as leader, and despite the falling sleet and snow, the forward section of the party united in another desperate effort to cross the summit, but encountered deeper drifts and greater difficulties. As darkness crept over the whitened waste, wagons became separated and lodged in the snow, and all had to cling to the mountainside until break of day, when the train again returned to its twice abandoned camp, having been compelled, however, to leave several of the wagons where they had become stalled. The report concluded with the statement that the men at once began log cutting for cabins in which the company might have to pass the winter. After the messengers left, and as father and Uncle Jacob were hastening preparations for our own departure, new troubles beset us. Uncle was giving the finishing touches to the axle when the chisel he was using slipped from his grasp, and its keen edge struck and made a serious wound across the back of father's right hand, which was steadying the timber. The crippled hand was carefully dressed, and to quiet Uncle's fears and discomfort, father made light of the accident, declaring that they had weightier matters for consideration than cuts and bruises. The consequences of that accident, however, were far more wide-reaching than could have been anticipated. Up and up we toiled until we reached an altitude of 6,000 feet, and were within about 10 miles of our companions at the lake, when the intense cold drove us into camp on Prosser Creek in Alder Creek Valley, a picturesque and sheltered nook 2½ miles in length and 3/4 of a mile in width. But no one observed the picturesque grandeur of the forest-covered mountains which hem it in on the north and west, nor that eastward and southward it looks out across plateaus to the Washoe Mountains 20 miles away. A piercing wind was driving storm clouds toward us, and those who understood their threatening aspect realized that 21 persons, 8 of them helpless children, were there at the mercy of the pitiless storm king. The teams were hurriedly unhooked, the tents pitched, and the men and women began collecting material for more suitable quarters. Some felled trees, some lopped off branches, and some, with oxen, dragged the logs into position. There was enough building material on the ground for a good-sized foundation 4 logs deep when night stopped the work. The moon and stars came out before we went to bed, yet the following morning the ground was covered with snow 2 or 3 feet in depth, which had to be shoveled from the exposed beds before their occupants could rise. I remember well that new day. All plans for log cabins had to be abandoned. There was no sheltered nook for shivering children, so father lifted Georgia and me onto a log, and mother tucked a buffalo robe around us, saying, "Sit here until we have a better place for you." There we sat, snug and dry, chatting and twisting our heads about, watching the hurrying, anxious workers. Those not busy at the wagons were helping the builders to construct a permanent camp. They cleared a space under a tall pine tree and reset the tent a few feet south of its trunk, facing the sunrise. Then, following the Indian method as described by John Baptiste, a rude semicircular hut of poles was added to the tent, the tree trunk forming part of its north wall, and its needled boughs, the rafters and cross pieces to the roof. The structure was overlaid so far as possible with pieces of cloth, old quilts and buffalo robes, then with boughs and branches of pine and tamarack. A hollow was scooped in the ground near the tree for a fireplace, and an opening in the top served as chimney and ventilator. One opening led into the tent and another served as an outer door. To keep the beds off the wet earth, 2 rows of short posts were driven along the sides of the tent, and the poles were laid across the tops, thus forming racks to support the pine boughs upon which the beds should be made. While this was being done, Elitha, Leanna, and Mrs. Wolfinger were bringing poles and brush with which to strengthen and sheath the tent walls against wind and weather. Even Sister Frances looked tall and helpful as she trudged by with her little loads. The combination of tent and hut was designed for my father and family and Mrs. Wolfinger. The teamsters, Samuel Shoemaker, Joseph Reinhardt, James Smith, and John Baptiste, built their hut in Indian wigwam fashion. Not far from us, across the stream, braced against a log, was reared a mixed structure of brush and tent for use of Uncle Jacob, Aunt Betsy, and William and Solomon Hook, Aunt Betsy's sons by a former husband, and their 5 small children, George, Mary, Isaac, Louis, and Samuel Donner. Before we 2 could leave our perch, the snow was falling faster and in larger flakes. It made pictures for Georgia and me upon the branches of big and little trees. It gathered in a ridge beside us upon the log, it nestled in piles upon our buffalo robe, and by the time our quarters were finished, it was veiling Uncle Jacob's from view. Everything within was cold, damp, and dreary, until our tired mother and elder sisters built the fire, prepared our supper, and sent us to bed, each with a lump of low sugar as comforter. End of chapter 6.